Listen up, because in 1985, ThunderCats wasn't just another toy commercial pretending to be a cartoon. This thing was massive. It pulled in around 4.5 million viewers per episode, cost roughly $300,000 per episode to produce, making it one of the most expensive animated shows of the decade, and built a mythology so rich that kids were seriously debating the Sword of Omens on the playground. It ran for 130 episodes, made over $100 million in toy sales in its first year, and looked better than almost anything else on television at the time. And yet, by 1989, it was gone. Cancelled. No grand finale. No real explanation. So what went wrong? Today, we're digging into the risky production gamble, the creative choices that set ThunderCats apart, and the 3 fatal mistakes that quietly killed a franchise that should have lasted for decades. How Rankin Bass reinvented the toy cartoon. Alright, so here's something most people don't realize. ThunderCats was created by the same people who made those stop-motion Christmas specials you watch every year. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, Santa Claus is Coming to Town. That was Rankin Bass Productions. By the early 1980s, Rankin Bass was looking to break into the toy-based cartoon market. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe had proven in 1983 that you could make a cartoon whose sole purpose was selling toys and make an absolute fortune. Mattel was generating hundreds of millions from He-Man merchandise. Every toy company wanted their own He-Man. Telepictures Corporation approached Rankin Bass with a proposition. They'd seen the success of He-Man and Transformers and G.I. Joe. They wanted to create an original property, not licensed from an existing toy line, that could compete in the afternoon syndication market. The toy company LJN would manufacture the action figures. Telepictures would handle distribution. Rankin Bass would create the show. But Rankin Bass didn't want to make just another cheap toy commercial. These were the people who'd made beloved family entertainment for decades. They had standards. They wanted to create something with actual mythology, real character development, and production values that elevated it above the competition. They brought in Ted Wolfe to develop the concept. The pitch: alien cat warriors crash land on a new planet, battle evil forces, and protect a mystical sword of power. It was He-Man meets sci-fi meets fantasy, but with a focus on team dynamics and found family, instead of just one muscle-bound hero. The budget they committed to was insane for syndicated afternoon animation. Approximately $300,000 per episode. Compare that to He-Man at around $100,000 per episode, or Transformers at $135,000. ThunderCats was spending 3 times what He-Man was spending on production. Why? Because they partnered with Pacific Animation Corporation in Japan for the actual animation, getting near theatrical quality movement and detail. The character designs by Katsuhiro Otomo, who'd later create Akira, were sophisticated and distinctive. The backgrounds were painterly and detailed. The action sequences were fluid and dynamic. And they hired real voice acting talent, not just the usual pool of afternoon cartoon performers. Larry Kenney brought genuine charisma to Lion-O. Earl Hyman gave Panthro depth and authority. Bob McFadden made Snarf simultaneously annoying and endearing. ThunderCats premiered in January 1985 in syndication with a 5-part miniseries event called Exodus. This wasn't just dropping a show into afternoon rotation. This was an event. 5 consecutive days of story, building the mythology, establishing the characters, and creating actual narrative stakes. The response was overwhelming. By the end of that first week, ThunderCats was the talk of playgrounds across America. Kids were hooked on the mythology. They wanted to know more about Thundera, the destroyed home planet. They wanted to understand the Sword of Omens and the Eye of Thundera. They were invested in Lion-O's journey from kid in an adult body to actual leader. Within months, ThunderCats was pulling 4.5 million viewers per episode and airing on over 130 stations nationwide. LJN's toy line was flying off shelves. The initial production run sold out completely within the first quarter. They couldn't manufacture figures fast enough to meet demand. By the end of 1985, ThunderCats had generated over $100 million in toy sales. The show wasn't just successful, it was a phenomenon. But there were cracks in the foundation from day one. Cracks that would eventually bring the whole thing crashing down. Mistake number 1. The production costs were unsustainable. Here's the brutal reality that killed ThunderCats. You can't spend $300,000 per episode on afternoon syndication and expect it to last. That budget bought amazing quality. ThunderCats looked better than almost anything else in afternoon animation. The transformation sequences were elaborate and beautiful. The fight choreography was dynamic and exciting. The world building was detailed and immersive. But syndication revenue couldn't support those costs long term. Syndicated shows made money from advertising sold to local stations, and those rates were fixed and relatively low. The business model required cheap production to be profitable. ThunderCats' first season of 65 episodes cost approximately $19.5 million to produce. That's an enormous investment for a syndicated show. And while toy sales were strong initially, they couldn't carry the production costs indefinitely. By season 2, the pressure was mounting. LJN and Telepictures wanted more episodes to keep the toy line fresh and maintain syndication presence. But they also wanted to reduce per-episode costs. So Rankin Bass had to make compromises. Season 2's production budget dropped to approximately $240,000 per episode, still expensive by industry standards, but a 20% reduction from Season 1. The animation quality noticeably declined. More limited movement, simpler backgrounds, less elaborate action sequences. Season 3 dropped further to around $200,000 per episode. More cost-cutting, more corner-cutting, more reliance on stock footage and repeated animation cycles. Season 4 was barely $150,000 per episode, half the original budget. And you could see it on screen. The show that had been visually stunning in 1985 looked cheap and rushed by 1988. The problem was structural. ThunderCats had established a quality level that required a certain budget to maintain. When that budget got cut, the show stopped being special, and when it stopped being special, it couldn't justify its existence. Compare that to cheaper shows like G.I. Joe or Transformers. Those shows started cheap and stayed cheap. Kids' expectations were calibrated to that level. But ThunderCats had trained its audience to expect theatrical quality animation. When the quality dropped, the betrayal was obvious. By 1989, the cost-cutting had gutted what made ThunderCats great, and the show was canceled. Mistake number 2, they ran out of story and started repeating themselves. Here's the creative problem that compounded the budget issues. ThunderCats ran out of compelling stories. The first 65 episodes, Season 1, told a complete arc. The ThunderCats established themselves on Third Earth. They built the cat's lair. They fought Mum-Ra and discovered the nature of his immortality. They explored the planet and met its various inhabitants. Lion-O grew from a child-minded adult into a true leader. That was a satisfying story with beginning, middle, and end. If ThunderCats had stopped at 65 episodes, it would be remembered as a tight, well-crafted series. But toy companies don't want 65 episodes. They want ongoing content to support ongoing toy sales. So ThunderCats kept going. Seasons 2 and 3 introduced the Thunder Kittens, kid characters clearly designed to sell toys to younger demographics. They brought in new villains like the Lunatics. Again, obvious toy line extension. They created the Burbles, the Warrior Maidens, the Snowmen of Hook Mountain. Every new group was a potential toy SKU, and the storytelling became repetitive. How many times can Mum-Ra attack the cat's lair with a different scheme? How many times can the Sword of Omens be stolen or threatened? How many times can Lion-O learn the same lesson about leadership? By Season 4, the show was clearly out of ideas. Episodes felt like filler. The mythology that had been so carefully constructed in Season 1 was being diluted with nonsensical additions. The characters weren't developing anymore. They were just going through motions. And here's what's frustrating. The writers knew it. Behind-the-scenes interviews from the late 80s show the creative team was aware they were stretching the premise beyond its natural limits. But the business demands required more content, so they kept producing it. The result was a show that went from must-watch television to background noise. Kids who'd been obsessed with ThunderCats in 1985 were losing interest by 1988 because the show wasn't giving them anything new. Mistake number 3, LJN mismanaged the toy line into the ground. This is the part that makes me angry because it was completely avoidable. In 1985 and 1986, ThunderCats toys were selling like crazy. The initial character figures, Lion-O, Panthro, Tigra, Chitara were everywhere. The vehicles like the Thunder Tank were best sellers. LJN had a hit on their hands, but then they made catastrophic decisions. First, they flooded the market. Instead of carefully managing releases and maintaining scarcity that drives demand, LJN produced massive quantities of figures and dumped them into retail. By late 1986, ThunderCats toys were constantly on clearance because there was too much inventory. Second, they made toys that nobody wanted. The Burble figures? Kids didn't care about the Burbles. The Snowmen of Hook Mountain? Who was asking for that? LJN was producing toys based on minor characters and one-off episodes instead of what fans actually wanted. Third, and this is the killer, they made the figures incompatible with other toy lines. He-Man figures were 5.5 inches. G.I. Joe figures were 3.75 inches. Those scales allowed crossover play. Kids could have Batman fight He-Man or whatever. ThunderCats figures were 6 inches with unique articulation. They didn't work with other toys. That limited their play value and made them less appealing. By 1987, ThunderCats toy sales were declining, despite the show still pulling decent ratings. By 1988, most retailers were discounting ThunderCats inventory heavily. By 1989, LJN had essentially abandoned the line. And here's the thing, when toy sales collapse, the show dies. The entire business model of these toy commercial cartoons was that toy revenue funded continued production. When LJN stopped making money from ThunderCats, they stopped funding new episodes. In 1989, LJN told Rankin's Bass and Telepictures they weren't renewing for Season 5. The show was canceled. Not because of ratings. ThunderCats was still pulling over 2 million viewers per episode. Not because of creative exhaustion, though that was a factor. It was canceled because the toy company that funded it had mismanaged the merchandise into unprofitability, failed revivals, and missed opportunities. Here's what happened after the cancellation. For 22 years, ThunderCats essentially disappeared. There were occasional comic book series, some attempted novel adaptations, persistent rumors of revivals that never materialized, but no new animated content. Why? Because the rights were a mess. Rankin's Bass had dissolved. Warner Brothers had acquired some of the properties. Time Warner held distribution rights. Ted Wolfe owned creative rights to the characters. Nobody could agree on who controlled what. In 2011, Cartoon Network finally produced a ThunderCats reboot. It was good, really good actually. Darker, more serialized, better animation. Critics loved it. Fans mostly liked it. And it was canceled after 1 season, 26 episodes. Why? Because Cartoon Network's new programming executive decided they wanted to focus on comedy instead of action-adventure. A literally executive whim killed a show that was performing well. In 2020, another reboot was attempted, ThunderCats Roar, this time as a comedy series aimed at younger kids. It was terrible. It was canceled after 1 season. ThunderCats is cursed. Every attempt to revive it fails, usually for reasons completely unrelated to the quality or popularity of the show itself. When ambition exceeds business model. So here's the thing about ThunderCats. It was too good for its own good. Rankin's Bass created a show with theatrical quality animation, sophisticated mythology, and genuine character development. They elevated afternoon syndication beyond cheap toy commercials into something that approached actual art, and the business model couldn't sustain it. The production costs were too high. The storytelling was too ambitious to maintain over 130 episodes. The toy partner mismanaged the merchandise. The rights holders couldn't agree on continuation. Every element that made ThunderCats special became a liability. The high budget became unsustainable. The complex mythology became exhausted. The quality expectations became impossible to maintain. ThunderCats succeeded creatively and failed commercially. It proved you could make something great in the toy commercial format, then proved that greatness couldn't last under those business constraints. And that's the tragedy. This should have been a franchise that lasted decades. The mythology was rich enough. The characters were compelling enough. The fan base was dedicated enough. But the system that created ThunderCats also destroyed it. So that's the rise and fall of ThunderCats, a show that dared to be better than it had to be, that created genuine mythology and character depth in a genre that usually offered neither. and that was killed by the very ambition that made it special. It's a story about how artistic ambition and business sustainability are often in conflict, about how doing something better doesn't guarantee it'll last longer, about how the toy commercial cartoon model could produce something great but couldn't sustain it. ThunderCats changed what afternoon animation could be, and then it proved that change couldn't survive in the system that existed. The 130 episodes will live forever as proof that toy commercials could be art. But ThunderCats will always be the franchise that deserved better than it got. If you can still do the thunder, thunder, ThunderCats ho yell from memory, you're my people. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite ThunderCat. Mine was Panthro, obviously. The man had nunchucks built into his gauntlets. And if you're not subscribed yet, there's a lot more animation history where this came from.